One of the things that I'm most grateful for is the life in which I've been able to live. And no, I'm not speaking in terms of my art. I'm talking about what led me to my journey of art and what inspired me to portray some of God's most beautiful creations. At the age of 23, I got my first job as a wildlife biology graduate. And that job led me to many different experiences throughout the next decade that inevitably shaped who I was and who I was to become. I met many extraordinary people along the way, made some of the most genuine and lasting friendships throughout all of this. But the one thing that I can't stop going back to is how lucky I was to expand my knowledge and understanding of what I'm passionate about most in life, which is wildlife and the outdoors. And in this video specifically, I'm referring to the Rocky Mountain elk. Elk to me are a fascinating animal. Their social dynamics is what intrigues me the most. Their personality traits from animal to animal vary greatly, and they really are much more social than probably most would ever bet. Part of my job duties throughout the years, and one of the main things that I did as a wildlife manager, was track these animals, the elk, with radio collars. I had the opportunity to study elk, to help manage elk, to help the parks and agencies learn about the populations, their movements, their behaviors. I really spent the majority of my time as a wildlife tech focusing on this tremendous animal. When I first started getting involved with these creatures, I was under the presumption that they were pretty basic. The males bugled, the cows mewed, they talked back and forth a little bit, and they generally moved along the landscape in a very basic way, communicating back and forth where each other are as they make their way from point A to point B and back again. I wasn't really aware of how deep their social dynamics went and really how special these animals are. I guess I mostly figured that their thought process didn't go much deeper than what they see in front of them and the calls that they hear from other elk. I suppose I just didn't give them much credit. I guess I figured that they probably didn't think much further beyond what they heard and smelled and could see in front of them. I figured that probably like most animals, their thought process was extremely basic and their behavior was most likely uniform throughout their population. But that actually couldn't be further from the truth, as I quickly began to learn over the months and years that their social structure, their ways of thinking, and their movements were very unique. And some of the animals we tracked would refuse to leave a square mile section, while others, being the same age, the same sex, in the same social situation, would go tens, if not hundreds of miles at times. Some would go these large distances and stay. Others would go and come right back 6 months later. And the more and more that I got to interact with these animals, the more I realized that not only did their movements differ so much, but their personality as well. Some of the elk preferred to stay in very tight, close family groups, while others liked to group up in large gatherings with many different family groups. Some welcomed other elk into their areas, while others avoided other elk when they came into their areas. And when it came to their language, it went even deeper. Depending on the landscape that they lived in, depending on the predators that existed where they live, they had different ways of speaking back and forth to each other. Sometimes loud, long, drawn-out calls in the prairie were non-existent in the high elevation, thick mountain timber covered regions where their calls not only didn't travel as far, but they had to worry more about some of the larger predators that existed around them. And so depending on how comfortable they could be in their given landscape, they almost develop different dialects within their language. And all of this can vary depending on the time of year, how much human pressure is in the area at any given time, and these swings in their calling and their movements are actually extremely variable and very fascinating. When I eventually moved to Montana, I could tell right away that I didn't know as much about the elk in this region as I thought I would. Like most places I've been, their behavior and their way of communication is unique. And one thing in particular that I'm drawn to is their migration, which on the prairie can sometimes be non-existent, as they don't have much incentive to go or travel long distances when their food and their water and their habitat is consistent where they are year-round. However, in places like Yellowstone and places that have huge swings in weather from season to season, their very survival is dependent on how they move through the landscape. Now, if you ask most people what time of the year do elk bugle, they would probably tell you during the breeding season, during September, or around that early to mid-fall time of year. However, what surprised me was how much they actually continue to vocalize and bugle well into late fall and into the winter. During a big migration like the one you see out of a place such as Yellowstone, where the environment gets so extreme during the winter, they're forced out of their preferable habitats for the summer and for the fall, and they're squeezed through these small gateways through the mountains where they have to all traverse on their way to their winter range where they can find safety and forage for the upcoming months. And when these smaller family groups and small herds begin to come together, these large bulls coming off of a long and grueling breeding season begin to meet each other face to face. All of these elk start to form very large herds for the winter. And as they come together, they begin to vocalize once again, establishing their dominance for the upcoming seasons, getting to know other elk in the area, because inevitably their survival will depend on staying together. And so learning to live with one another again is a necessity. This painting takes place in a real location, a valley that holds special meaning to my heart. And it's also one of the major stopping points along one of the largest migration routes out of Yellowstone. And I'll never forget being there for the first time in mid to late December, when I thought a lot of the elk activity had calmed down, hearing these old, lonesome-sounding bugles in the distance, dozens of them, hundreds of them all day, as these herd bulls begin to start communicating with one another as they're forced into larger herds. However, this time, instead of sounding aggressive towards one another, their calls were much different, much lower in tone, more drawn out, less raspy, and a lot more dynamic. The tones of these bugles change mid-call. They change from bugle to bugle. They're much more communicative. The cows as well begin to talk a lot more amongst one another. However, the excitement in all of these vocalizations is almost non-existent. I watched these elk at this time for hours sitting on the hill and listening to their calls back and forth. And it just brought me back to all the experiences that I've been fortunate to have and all the things that I love so much about not only elk, but their habitat and the beauty of all of these different areas. In this scene, I imagine a bull elk stepping out into the wide open, letting out a lonesome call, alerting other elk in the area as they call back, and the migration as a whole is on. The journey for these elk and their survival through winter has just begun, and the obstacles and stories that lie ahead in their path is what fascinates me and what gets me excited to create and share. Thank you for watching, and enjoy the rest of the painting.